There is an invisible pattern that separates two people who appear to be living the same life. They wake up at the same time. They work the same number of hours. They earn similar salaries. They go to similar places. But after a few years, something strange happens. One of them builds assets, invests, creates opportunities, begins to make money even when not working. The other remains trapped in the same cycle. Bills get paid, the paycheck arrives, the paycheck disappears. And when someone observes this from the outside, they usually explain it with words that are far too simple. Luck, talent, intelligence, rich family. But one of the richest men in history, Andrew Carnegie, had a much colder and much more technical explanation. Carnegie was born into extreme poverty in Scotland. His family lived in a small house, constantly struggling to pay for food and coal to heat the winter. When he was still a child, the family decided to cross the ocean in search of survival in the United States. They arrived with almost no money. Carnegie began working while he was still a boy, first as a worker in a cotton factory, then as a messenger in a telegraph company. Nothing in his life suggested that one day he would become one of the richest men who had ever lived. But for years, he observed something. And that observation completely changed his financial destiny. Carnegie realized that there was a behavior that separated ordinary workers from people who became powerful. It was not intelligence. It was not formal education. It was not luck. It was a mental habit. A silent habit. A habit that almost no one notices. And one that most people simply never practice. Most people live reacting to the present. They wake up thinking about what needs to be solved today. The credit card bill. The meeting. The problem at work. The exhaustion. The traffic. The worry about the end of the month. They live in survival mode. That means all their mental energy is consumed by the present moment. And when your entire mind is occupied with surviving the present, you never build the future. Andrew Carnegie noticed that the most powerful men he met had a different habit. All of them had a daily period dedicated to thinking. Not thinking about problems. Thinking about direction. Thinking about construction. Thinking about how to transform work into systems. Carnegie used to say that most people work a lot, but think very little. And this creates a brutal financial trap, because when you only work, your income always depends on your presence. Your time becomes currency. You trade hours for money. But when you begin to think strategically, something changes. You begin searching for structures, systems, leverage, things that continue functioning even when you are not present. That is how Carnegie began to stand out while he was still very young. While other messengers were simply delivering messages, he studied how the telegraph system worked. While other workers only wanted to finish their shift, he observed who was making decisions inside the company. He wanted to understand who controlled the money, who controlled the opportunities, who controlled the growth. And during that process, he realized something that most people never notice. There is a brutal difference between working inside a system and owning a system. Most people spend their entire lives being a piece inside some structure. A company, an industry, business. They execute tasks, solve problems, produce value, but they never control the machine. Carnegie began asking a different question. He constantly asked, "How could this work without me?" That question is powerful because it forces your mind out of survival mode. It forces you to think like an architect, not like a laborer. And this is exactly where the habit appears that separates those who become wealthy from those who merely survive. People who only survive focus on tasks. People who become wealthy focus on structures. A person in survival mode thinks like this: how do I solve this problem today? A person in building mode thinks differently. How do I build something that solves this forever? That small shift in mentality completely changes someone's financial destiny, because tasks always end. And when they end, the money ends too. But structures keep working. Even when you are sleeping, even when you are traveling, even when you decide to stop working. Carnegie realized this by observing the railroad industry. At that time, Railroads were expanding rapidly across the United States. Thousands of workers were involved in that growth. Engineers, laborers, builders. But the people who were truly becoming wealthy were not the workers. They were the owners of the structures, the investors, the men who controlled the rails. Because every time a train passed, the money returned to them. This completely changed the way Carnegie viewed work. He stopped thinking only about salaries and began thinking about participation. Participation in companies, participation in systems, participation in industries. That mindset became the beginning of his empire. But there is an extremely important psychological detail here. And it is exactly this detail that causes most people to fail. Thinking strategically requires something the human brain does not like: discomfort. Because when you begin thinking about structures, you start realizing how many things in your life are being done only for survival. You start noticing how many decisions were made out of immediate necessity instead of long-term construction. This can be frustrating. But Carnegie said something extremely direct. He stated that most people are not poor because of a lack of opportunity. They are poor because they never trained their minds to see opportunities. They train their minds only to deal with urgencies. And urgencies are infinite. There will always be bills. There will always be problems. There will always be tasks. If you do not deliberately create space to think, your entire life will be consumed by reacting. And reacting never builds wealth. Wealth is born from anticipation, from planning, from vision. Carnegie had an extremely simple habit. Every day, he reserved time to think without interruptions. No tasks, no rush, no distractions. He analyzed markets, thought about opportunities, observed behaviors, tried to predict what would happen in the coming years. This habit seemed unproductive to many people around him. While others were busy running, he was standing still, reflecting. But those silent hours created enormous decisions, decisions that would later move millions of dollars. Because when you think deeply, you begin to see patterns. And those who see patterns can act before everyone else. That is one of the greatest secrets of wealth. It is not about working more. It is about seeing sooner. Carnegie saw earlier that steel would become the heart of the new industrial economy. Railroads needed steel. Bridges needed steel. Ships needed steel. Entire cities would need steel. While many investors were still focused on iron, Carnegie began building an empire in steel. And that turned him into one of the richest men in history. But the most curious part is that everything started with something extremely simple: a mental habit. Thinking strategically every single day. It may sound small, but in practice, it is revolutionary. They spend entire years without stopping to analyze their own financial lives, without asking, where exactly am I going? Is this work building something lasting or just paying bills? Is there a smarter way to do this? Without these questions, life becomes an automatic sequence of obligations. And before you realize it, 10 years have passed, 20 years have passed, and nothing has truly changed. Andrew Carnegie observed this happening to hundreds of people around him. Hardworking men, honest, dedicated, but completely trapped in repetitive cycles. They never stopped to design the future. They only faced the present. And here is an uncomfortable truth. Working hard does not guarantee wealth. Millions of people work hard every single day. But few build assets. Few create systems. Few train their minds to see structural opportunities. Carnegie used to say that wealth begins when you change the central question of your life. Most people ask, how much can I earn? But people who build fortunes ask, what can I build? That shift in question changes everything. Because earning depends on effort. Building depends on strategy. And strategy is born in the silence of thought, not in the rush of everyday life. If you observe carefully the people who accumulate wealth over decades, almost all of them share this habit. They reserve time to think, to analyze, to study, to plan. That time seems invisible, but it is where the decisions that change financial destinies are made. Andrew Carnegie believed this habit was so important that without it, anyone would eventually become trapped in survival cycles, even if they worked hard, even if they were intelligent. Because without strategic thinking, work becomes only the maintenance of life, not the construction of wealth. But there is a second level to this habit, a level that very few people reach. And it was exactly this that allowed Carnegie to move from being a millionaire to becoming one of the most powerful men on the planet. Because thinking strategically is only the beginning. The next step is far more difficult. It is learning to act against the natural behavior of most people. And this is the point where almost everyone fails. Because there is an extremely delicate moment in the journey of anyone who begins to think strategically. It is the moment when you realize something that completely changes your view of money. You realize that effort is not the main factor of wealth. This discovery can be uncomfortable. Throughout our lives, we are taught that working hard is the path to prosperity. The idea seems logical. More effort should generate more results. But when Andrew Carnegie began observing the richest men in American industry, he noticed something unsettling. Many of them were not the ones who worked the most. In fact, some of them worked far less than their own employees. Yet they accumulated enormous fortunes. This led Carnegie to study a concept that today is called economic leverage. But at the time, he described it in a very simple way. He said there are two types of people in the business world: those who multiply effort and those who multiply results. Most people multiply effort. They work more hours, accept more tasks, take on more responsibilities. This may even increase income. But there is an inevitable physical limit. A day has 24 hours. The body gets tired. The mind becomes saturated. And when you stop, the money stops too. People who build wealth learn to multiply results. They look for ways to make a single decision generate repeated impact. This was one of the central principles of Carnegie's empire. When he entered the steel industry, he was not only thinking about selling metal. He was thinking about controlling entire stages of the production chain: mining, transportation, processing, distribution. He wanted each part of the structure to feed the others. This created something powerful, an integrated system. While competitors depended on external suppliers, Carnegie controlled almost everything. This reduced costs, increased speed, and multiplied profits. But what few people realize is that this vision began long before he had money. It began with a mental habit. The habit of constantly asking, what is the real engine of this business? That question changes everything. Because many businesses appear profitable on the surface, but the real money is hidden somewhere else within the structure. For example, during the California gold rush, thousands of people rushed to dig for gold. Most ended up poor. But some men became extremely wealthy selling tools, equipment, and infrastructure to the miners. They understood the engine of the system. Carnegie applied this type of reasoning constantly. He studied entire industries before making decisions. He observed where the money truly concentrated, where the bottlenecks were, where the dependencies existed, and most importantly, where the opportunities for control were. This type of thinking is rare because it requires intellectual patience. And patience is something most people lose when money is involved. The urgency to make money quickly causes many to ignore deep analysis. They enter opportunities driven by excitement, by the fear of missing out, or by the promise of fast returns. Carnegie avoided this kind of behavior. He believed that true wealth is not born from haste. It is born from strategic positioning. He preferred to wait, to study, to observe. And when he acted with intensity. This pattern repeated many times in his life. But there is another habit he considered even more important, and almost no one talks about it. Carnegie trained his mind to tolerate long-term vision. This sounds simple, but in practice, it is extremely difficult. The human brain is programmed to seek quick rewards. Small immediate gratifications activate our pleasure system. Buying something new, making quick money, receiving social approval. All of this generates instant satisfaction. But building wealth usually requires the opposite. It requires decisions that do not generate immediate rewards, investments that take years to mature, projects that take time to produce results, strategies that seem slow at the beginning. Many people start this path, but give up halfway. They trade long-term vision for quick gains. Carnegie called this the impatience trap. He said impatience destroys more potential fortunes than lack of intelligence, because people even find good opportunities, but abandon them before they grow. It is like planting a tree. In the first years, it seems like nothing is happening. Growth is slow. The roots are expanding beneath the soil, but someone looking from the outside may think the effort is not worth it. Many give up at that moment. Carnegie did not. He understood that some financial structures take time to reveal their true power, and that understanding allowed him to endure long periods of construction. This creates a brutal advantage, because when you can maintain long-term vision, you begin competing in a game that few people are willing to play. Most people want fast results. You are building lasting structures, and when those structures finally begin generating returns, growth can become exponential. That is exactly what happened with the Carnegie Steel Company. For years, he aggressively reinvested in the growth of the company, expanded factories, modernized processes, improved logistics. While many entrepreneurs were satisfied with moderate profits, Carnegie wanted to dominate the sector. He believed scale created power, and power created wealth. This strategy worked extraordinarily well. At the peak of his empire, the company produced more steel than almost any competitor. This caught the attention of one of the most powerful men in financial history, J.P. Morgan. Morgan wanted to consolidate the steel industry in the United States, and to do that, he needed the largest company in the sector, Carnegie's company. The negotiation that followed became legendary. In 1901, Carnegie sold his company to Morgan. The value of the transaction was approximately $480 million. At that time, it was an almost unimaginable sum. Carnegie's personal share alone exceeded $200 million. In today's value, that represents tens of billions. But there is a fascinating detail in this story. Carnegie was already over 60 years old when he made this sale. This means the greatest financial reward of his life came after decades of silent construction, decades thinking strategically, decades analyzing structures, decades tolerating slow growth at the beginning, decades refusing fast opportunities that did not create real power. This type of trajectory reveals something many people do not like to hear. Wealth building is a game of decades, not months, not shortcuts, not magic formulas. It is a cumulative process. Each strategic decision adds to the previous one. Each structure created open space for another. Each well-positioned investment generates new opportunities. But all of this begins with an extremely simple habit: thinking. Thinking deeply. Thinking strategically. Thinking with discipline. Andrew Carnegie used to say that the most powerful asset any person possesses is their own mind, but only if it is trained to observe the world differently, trained to see patterns, trained to identify leverage, trained to constantly ask, what here has the potential to grow? What here could become a system? Because Andrew Carnegie believed that wealth is never built alone. At first, this idea may sound strange. There is a very popular myth about great entrepreneurs. The image of the lone genius, the man who alone had a great idea, worked harder than everyone else, and built an empire purely through his own effort. But Carnegie knew that this story is rarely true. In reality, great fortunes are almost always the result of networks of intelligence, competent people working together, different specialists contributing to the same structure. Carnegie had a phrase that became famous in the business world. He used to say, "Men who can surround themselves with people smarter than themselves become extraordinary leaders." This mindset was one of the foundations of his company's growth. Carnegie did not try to be the best at everything. He did not need to be the best engineer. He did not need to be the best factory operator. He did not need to be the best administrator. Instead, he looked for people who were extremely competent in those areas, and he built strong teams around them. This creates something powerful. When you bring together several capable minds working within a common system, decision-making capacity grows exponentially. Problems are solved faster. Ideas are refined. Errors are detected before they become crises. But there is an important psychological detail here. Most people feel uncomfortable working with people who are more intelligent than they are. There is a natural tendency to protect one's ego. Some leaders avoid hiring highly capable people because they fear losing authority. Carnegie did exactly the opposite. He sought brilliant people, and he gave them space to operate. This attitude created an extremely efficient organization. But there is an even deeper point. Carnegie believed that wealth does not depend only on technical intelligence. It depends on shared mentality. He said that a negative mental environment can destroy any company. If the people around you are constantly complaining, doubting, criticizing, fearing change, the entire system loses speed. On the other hand, when a group shares ambition, discipline, and a vision for growth, the collective energy becomes extremely powerful. This explains something many people ignore. Environments shape destinies. The conversations you hear every day influence your decisions far more than you imagine. If someone lives surrounded by people who think only about survival, that mindset becomes the norm. Decisions begin to be based on fear. Avoid risk. Avoid change. Avoid growth. But when someone lives around people who think about building, about expansion, about opportunity, the brain begins to operate differently. New possibilities appear. New strategies emerge. Carnegie took great care with this aspect. He spent much of his time talking with ambitious people, engineers, investors, strategists. These conversations fueled new ideas, new visions of markets, new opportunities. And here there is an extremely interesting pattern. Great entrepreneurs almost always maintain constant contact with other strong minds, not only for friendship, but for intellectual stimulation. Because ideas grow when they are discussed. They evolve. They become refined. They become stronger. This type of environment creates something Carnegie valued greatly: momentum. Momentum is when a system begins to gain its own speed. Decisions lead to new decisions. Opportunities lead to new opportunities. Relationships open unexpected doors. But there is a silent trap in this process, and Andrew Carnegie warned about it frequently. He said that many people want the results of wealth, but are not willing to change the mental environment in which they live. They remain surrounded by limiting thoughts. They remain in circles where financial growth is viewed with suspicion or even hostility, and this creates an internal conflict. The person tries to grow, but the emotional environment around them pulls them backward. Carnegie believed that one of the most important decisions in anyone's life is choosing their influences carefully. Because ideas are contagious. Ambition is contagious. Discipline is contagious. But the opposite is also true. Discouragement is contagious. Destructive skepticism is contagious. Complacency is contagious too. He used to say that no one can build something extraordinary while living in a small mental environment. That is why, throughout his life, Carnegie always sought to expand his circles of relationships, meeting new people, listening to new perspectives, learning from different minds. This habit fueled his strategic capacity. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of Carnegie's philosophy is not how he built wealth. It is what he decided to do after he had already become extremely rich. Because after selling his company and accumulating an enormous fortune, Carnegie made a decision that shocked many people. He decided to give away almost all of his wealth. To understand this decision, it is necessary to understand a principle he called the gospel of wealth. Carnegie believed that wealth had a purpose greater than personal comfort. In his view, people who accumulated great fortunes had a social responsibility. He said that dying extremely rich was a form of moral failure, because concentrated money without purpose benefits no one. That is why he began funding massive projects in education, science, and culture. He helped build more than 2,000 public libraries. He funded universities, research institutions, educational projects. He believed that access to knowledge was the greatest tool for social transformation. This perspective reveals something very interesting. For Carnegie, wealth was not just an objective. It was a tool to build something greater. And perhaps this is one of the deepest reflections we can take from his story. The habit that separates those who become wealthy from those who merely survive is not only financial. It is mental. It is the decision to live deliberately, to think strategically, to build structures, to choose environments that stimulate growth, to tolerate long-term vision, and to transform effort into systems. When these habits combine, a person's financial destiny can change completely. But most people never develop this set of habits. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires mental discipline. It requires patience. It requires the courage to think differently from the majority. And Andrew Carnegie believed that this is exactly where the real division lies between two types of lives: the life that only reacts to the world, and the life that learns to build it.